right, welcome to today's episode of Tomorrow's Leader, where we dive deep on all things leader related to leading yourself, leading others, of course. And today we have a great privilege to have a really cool guest, a guy who I've gotten to know over the last few months, Vaughan Scott. Vaughan has been, wow, this guy's done a lot. He's a serial entrepreneur. He is currently leading an MBA program that actually is called Consult MBA. Really, really cool stuff. We're going to get into that a little bit, and has certainly had his hands in everything from helping families on financial planning end all the way through all kinds of businesses, software, and of course, leadership. So Vaughan, welcome to the show. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So tons of questions I want to ask you, but I'd love maybe just to start for the audience before we really get into stuff. Why don't you bring everybody up to kind of your current place? Maybe a really quick little background on how you got to the point that you are right now. You've obviously achieved a lot. I think people would love to hear that.
Yeah, I always say it kind of reminds me of a Grateful Dead song. What a long, strange trip it's been. Right out of college, I actually went into the restaurant business and then transitioned after being in the restaurant business, leading a couple of teams there, running. My first operation had 115 employees, 4 managers, and I was 25 years old. So it was really an interesting place to start early. Went into the financial services industry on the banking side, ultimately knowing I wanted to get into more of the wealth management part of the arena, and then transitioned after a couple of years in banking. And it's funny, when I got into the wealth management business, I found I had a real affinity for working with entrepreneurs and family enterprises, and everybody thought that the banking experience had done so much for me. And truth was, it was the restaurant experience, and dealing with all different kinds of people, dealing with the public, in some interesting situations, and really just dealing with large numbers of team members with diverse backgrounds and diverse experiences. I learned so much more from that. So,
and at a young age too, at 25, you're thrown into that's a tall time. I mean, I used to work in the restaurant business. I know you got a lot of strong personalities there that you got teeth pretty early in a big way.
Yeah, I actually helped one of my father's friends. I didn't know it was a turnaround, but at 23, that was my first assignment as a leader of a team, and I was ultimately tasked with doing a turnaround. The business was on the brink of failure, and truly was just asked to come take a look at it as a favor to my father and to his friend, and ended up working with them for 6-8 months to actually do what I know now was a turnaround, but I had no idea what I knew what needed to be done. I had no idea that it was what you would call a turnaround today. So it was, that was at 23. So it's been an interesting career, that's for sure.
So did you know you kind of had the knack for leadership at that point? Did it hit you pretty quickly or what?
I don't think that I did. And it two things that were apparent that weren't apparent to me early is that I did have a knack for leadership, but that also I had a knack for entrepreneurship. I was really interested in just kind of digging into things and figuring out how we could fix them and how we can make things better. And but no, it didn't really occur to me until I was in my 30s, which is kind of ironic. Well into my career and having a family, both suddenly became apparent to me.
Yeah. Was there something that happened, or what was it that made you kind of realize, I'm pretty good at this?
I think it was when I finally, as as we're building our careers, we're very busy and we're just working as hard as we can. And I really one day just kind of took stock of the people that were coming to me for advice and thinking about the way other people viewed them, as leaders in the community. And I had also had the opportunity. I had chaired a couple of boards very early. I think I chaired my first board at 28. So it was just sort of a culmination of events. But I did, and it was humbling to think about. But yeah, it was probably well into my mid 30s before I really figured out A, that I was a strong leader, and B, that I was really an entrepreneur.
Is it, and I know there's different viewpoints. A lot of people feel like, okay, you either have it as a leader, you don't have it as a leader. Do you feel that experience when you were thrown into that restaurant experience, for example, 25? Did you have it right away? Did you have to grow into it along? Does it take a while?
I think I felt like I had to grow into it. I mean, in some regards, I look back and I actually, the ironic thing is that at 23, I actually, as a leader, I think I was more mature than I was at 25. And I think it's because I had some early success that I was a bit overconfident. And then I made some mistakes as a result. And I think the one thing, whether you call it servant leadership or humility or whatever the case may be, I do think that those traits in leaders are really, really important. Which means that sometimes you don't, as I feel like, again, I figured it out a bit later in life. But I feel like in some ways I'm a better leader for it because, I do naturally really value the team. I put a lot of faith in them as people. And I listen to them, and I oftentimes trust them more than I trust myself in terms of the things that they feel are important or the things that we need to do. Ultimately, you still have to make decisions and you have to move the whole team forward.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like in many ways it was beneficial that I didn't just have this image of myself as being some kind of super leader from early.
Well, and it's interesting. You bring up, servant leadership and really working with a team. I mean, a lot of leaders, I think, have a different perspective. I talk to leaders all the time. I've talked to some that just get frustrated because they feel like they early on don't really get it and have a lot of success, so they feel like they're not destined for it, which I think is without a doubt a mistake. And then a lot of leaders that kind of just put it all on themselves. They don't necessarily tap in to the team the way that you're talking about. Do you see that as a big mistake? And how does a leader get to that point where if they're not doing that really well, how do they do that? How do they get to the point they've got a team that they can really, tap into?
Yeah, I do think a lot of leaders put it on themselves, and I know earlier, I was the first in the office and the last to go home, and that I think for whatever reason during the era that at least I was trying to ascend my career, that was what I knew. And when I finally figured out that, hey, if we really function as a true team, if we operate as a team, if we trust each other and we let each other leverage our strengths, then we're going to be a whole lot better in the collective than we are working as individuals. And I do think it's something that has to be learned over time. I'm a bigger and bigger believer in it. When I look at leaders, and I work with a lot of leaders as well, and when I see the most successful leaders, they definitely have a direction. They definitely have places that they want to take the team, but they definitely are listening to the team along the way, and they're willing to change the course if it becomes apparent or if the team really demonstrates that, hey, we need to think differently about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're not afraid to go off the track that they are on, to take some risk or whatnot. Okay.
That's right. And they don't beat people up for failures. That's the other challenge is that you really have to make sure that you set the expectation that if we're really going to grow and learn, that we're going to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to fail at things. And that, the key is not making the same mistakes again and again and again, to fail quickly and move on.
Yeah, there's a lot of great leaders that not only embrace that, they almost recognize and reward mistakes because it's taking risk and stepping outside of the comfort zone. Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the current environment. I mean, a lot going on now. This is a time where, and for those listening at a different time, we're at the end of the hopefully end of pandemic and in the midst of quarantine and soon to come out of it in phases. But leaders are really tested right now. This is a time where you need really great leadership. What do leaders need to be thinking about right now? What are the things that they need to be conscious of?
It's interesting, and it's a great question. I really believe that what's happened in large measure is that most leaders have been used to operating in two modes, either the tactical mode or a strategic mode, or both simultaneously. And what's happened as a result of all that's gone on is we've added a third mode to the equation, and that's just the basic survival mode. And so, many leaders haven't had to think about the basic survival of their business ever in many respects, or at least since early in their business's trajectory. And now we really have to think about each of those three modes simultaneously. And what's interesting is that I think some businesses have now put the survival question to bed. They really are in a place where they know they're going to survive, but maybe they're more tactical than they need to be, and maybe they're not quite as strategic today as they could be. So I think being very intentional about thinking about where you are or where your business is, and in many large businesses, it can be where are the various divisions within our business, and really identifying which of the three modes that they're in or which of the three modes they need to be in. And so that's something that I think that leaders need to be thinking about today that's different, is that it really is. I mean, we know academically it's a different environment. We know intuitively, all the evidence is there. But I think that thinking about those three kind of modes of operation, and in some cases, you need to have members of your team assigned to each of those, different types of modes of operation.
You work with, I know, a lot of leaders. What kind of leaders or businesses do you think come out of this stronger than they were before?
It's interesting. I don't think that it cuts across industries. In other words, certainly technology, has been stronger in terms of how quickly it seems to have rebounded, generally speaking. But across the board, I've seen businesses that have really been able, some making some very tough decisions early on, are now really looking at not only how they're going to, survive in the new environment, but really thrive in the new environment. It really does. Today, it is all about leadership. It's really, who's willing to make the tough decisions, who's willing to be very open and honest and candid with everybody about what's going on. Those are the folks generally. I mean, that's what I've seen, is that it's those who are more transparent, who are more honest, who are more open. That seems to be a greater indicator of how quickly they can get to a place where they can stabilize, at least, and then, and in some cases really, really start to grow. Versus those who want to just pretend like everything's okay and it's all going to be fine. And I think we all know that nobody has clear answers today.
Well, and it's interesting because a lot of leaders, I think, they're very guarded about the information, and they don't share it with their team or their employees or associates with regard to how the business is actually doing. There's a lot of, and you brought up earlier with your restaurant, you didn't realize how bad of a position that the restaurant was in. That would have been helpful for you to know that.
Yeah.
Day one. You didn't know you were doing a turnaround until you got, well into it, right?
That's right.
Which is strange, because that's something, when you share that and you have that transparency, there's a lot of people on that team that really want to fight, and they're gonna react differently. They're gonna put in more work. They're gonna think differently, right? If they know what's really going on.
That's right. Well, and I'm a big believer in the absence of good, honest information. The voids get filled with a lot of bad information and misinformation and things that are more corrosive than they are productive.
Yeah, exactly. People make up their own narrative that
Exactly.
tends to be worse than the reality sometimes.
And a lot of times I think we forget, team members, they don't understand the complexities of the business, or the complexities of the balance sheet, or the complexities of the financial statements every month. It seems like, if our top line revenue is so high, of course we've got to be making money, but they don't think about literally all of the line items that flow through in the P&L before you can push anything out the bottom. And it's not that they're, ignorant, or, they just don't know. I mean, they haven't, if you don't expose them to that information and make them aware of it, it just seems like, surely to goodness, there's, just money being made hand over fist, just based on what we see at the top line.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you and I were talking the other day, and you brought up some questions that are really good. And I think that was one of them, like asking leaders. Do you want to talk about that? The two questions, or tough questions, I think you mentioned that you like to ask.
Oh, you talking about as it relates to the action learning
Yeah. And we might be jumping ahead. So if you want to start at a different place, we can.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, so essentially action learning, and I can bring up, let me pull up, for those who can see this. So yeah, action learning is is a process that I think all leaders need to become aware of, especially in an environment where things are changing very rapidly. Um, and the nice thing is that this has actually been around since the 20s. So the father of action learning is a guy named Reg Revens. So Reg was an Olympic athlete for the UK, did the long jump, triple jump, high jump, but he actually worked on a team at Cambridge at a time which was interesting, obviously, around the development of or understanding the atomic structure and obviously ultimately dealing with nuclear warfare, and not too far behind it. But he actually worked in the lab at Cambridge with Ernest Rutherford, and so the questions that he would ask that I think are important, that Rutherford would ask, that I think are important for leaders to ask today, which really helped lead to action learning, is, first of all, what does your ignorance look like? So you can imagine that in Cambridge, you've got the most brilliant minds of the time talking about some of the most complex problems. And he wasn't really interested, the leader of this team was not interested in what they knew. He was interested in what they didn't know. And he constantly challenged them to think about that. And then the second question was what are you really afraid of that you don't want to talk about? And let's discuss that as well. Let's put those kinds of topics on the table. And I think today, it's really critical that we do ask ourselves, what does our ignorance look like? Because the things are changing at such a rapid pace. We've always said, the rate of change is accelerating, and we know that intuitively. But today, it's really just a completely different level of change. And so thinking about these things and really understanding action learning itself, I think is really, really helpful. So when you think about those questions, what does our ignorance look like? And what is it that we're really scared of? The thing that was sort of born of that was this formula that Revens developed, which is learning is the sum of a small p, the program knowledge. That means all of the things that we learn in school, the institutional knowledge that we have as organizations, but having a much larger Q, a large questioning insight. And that really, it's more important that we surround problems with questions today than to immediately come up with answers. And I think leaders often, and I've seen them in the war room or seen them in different situations where it's like we want to get to answers, we want to get to answers, we want to get to answers, and sometimes it's really a better first step to actually get to taking a step back and asking better questions. And that's really what Revens would espouse as well, because we don't know. We can't assume that we know everything, and we really need to be in a position where we have team members that understand that there are times when we have to make decisions that we have to move, but there are also times when we need to take a step back and make sure we're surrounding the problems with the right questions, and frankly, that we're considering that maybe things have changed, maybe things are different, and that we can't apply the same linear logic. We tend to want to take the easier route out to say, what's the problem? Who do we know that's dealt with it? Let's talk to them and figure out how they dealt with it. That we're looking for prescriptive kinds of answers. And realistically, we want to make sure that we're asking the right questions first.
That's such a good point. And I think that's it's almost a skill set you need to develop. I mean, there's a lot of leaders that don't know the questions to ask. And you gave two great ones there. When you do that, when you ask the right questions, I mean, I think, do you feel like it's sometimes leaders feeling like, okay, if I ask questions, it's almost it's an ego thing. It's like, hey, I wouldn't be asking the question if I knew the answer. Is that the obstacle, or they just don't know what to ask?
It can be, and I do think, again, the best leaders that I see are truly humble leaders. They really. The other thing is that I think some leaders too have used questions as a way to corner people. It's like cross-examining someone in the witness box. And so if that environment exists on the team, then asking questions has a whole different meaning, potentially, or a whole different perception than what they're intended to have. So it's truly a situation where you can truly ask questions in earnest. And I say all the time, when people ask me, how do you do all the things that you do? All of the things that I have on my plate at any given time. And I quite simply say, I have great teams. It's all about the teams, and it's all about the leaders on the team. It's not about me. And the other thing that I will say is that I work very hard, and it's not that hard, thankfully, to make myself the dumbest person in the room. So I want people who are far smarter than I am to really be there to help make good decisions and to take great care of the people that we take care of.
And that helps you trust the fact that you've got a great team around you. When you have that mentality and you're really trying to find people that are better or smarter than you, or build them up to be better or smarter than you,
Sure.
then you really do have a team that's going to be a team that operates at high effectiveness and one that you can rely on.
The other thing that I really do very deliberately, and I do believe this helps leaders, because especially leaders who've led smaller teams and the team has grown, or where leaders have really kind of been the fountain of wisdom, for a long period of time, which can work or has been able to work. I think it's much more challenging today to be able to perpetuate that in any way. Is that they really have to make a sincere effort to point out when other people have greater expertise than they do, and literally point other people to talk to them about questions or solutions. So I have members of different teams that in the businesses that I have where, I will say very quickly, Michelle knows far more about that than I will ever know. We really need to talk to her about this. Or I'll say, Lynn's got 10 times the experience that I do in this area. Let's talk to him about it. It's really something that we need to think about. But I would feel much better getting his counsel than giving you an answer.
That's almost like a great, acid test for a leader. If they're listening right now, how many times do they say that? How many times are they directing people to others, or are they the type that's trying to absorb everything and they're the go-to person for everything? I've seen leaders like that they get stuck in this, can't break through the ceiling of complexity because everything rolls to them. And you only have so much capacity, and then your organization is only as good as you are.
That's right.
Yeah. So, oh, go on.
Well, I was going to say, and I've seen, it's amazing how large organizations can become, using that model. But the bigger the organizations become, the more challenging it is for them to transition, to become more adaptive and resilient to change, to do the things that they need to do to be successful into the future.
Mm-hmm.
It really creates enormous challenges. But the good news is these are things that some of the greatest transitions that I've witnessed are leaders that were and really prided themselves on being these fountains of all knowledge or fountains of wisdom, and that they really just basically admitted this flaw, told the team they were going to work on it, and then lived up to their word. Showed and demonstrated in every way that they were going to make the transition, and it's pretty amazing when leaders can do that. Because ultimately there are obviously leaders, or they wouldn't have the teams that they have. They wouldn't have developed them. But it's very, very powerful when they really own that transition and take personal responsibility.
Oh yeah, and stick with it too, because a lot of leaders, they'll get feedback or they'll become aware of some kind of gap or opportunity. They'll make a change, but then 2 weeks later they're back to their old self.
And the real acid test, even when it looks like they've made this major transition and transformation, is when there's real distress or duress. That's when that's when the team knows whether this is temporary or permanent. And if they can see in some of the most challenging situations, the most difficult decisions, that there's really been a transformation or a transition in the way the leader thinks and operates, it's very powerful stuff.
Yeah. So I want to get into a little more about what you are teaching, and through the Consultant MBA program. You and I were talking about some great stuff. So I'd love to dive back into that if we can. I know you were sharing about well, we can jump to wherever you want to.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, it's interesting what you're referring to, and I'll page back a couple slides. Is that one of the things that I believe today that's just critical is that we really think about leadership in a very similar way to driving a car. And there's a reason that the windshield is bigger than the rear view mirror. And I think in a lot of decisions that have gotten made in companies up until now, we've really been able to rely on historical information, historical data, historical numbers, historical trends, to really inform what we need to do for the next 3 to 5 years or next year or whatever the case may be. And I really do believe now more than ever, this image of the windshield is really analogous to how we need to think about how we want to lead and how we want to move our teams and organizations forward. We really need to see the road in front of us as well as we possibly can. The challenge is that we don't always know what's coming down the road, and really if we're using the rear view mirror, it's a bit like trying to drive a car. If you can imagine, we're just going to use a rear view mirror, and we want to get home from wherever it is. If it's more than half a block from our home, trying to get anywhere using the rear view mirror is incredibly challenging. But if we can use the windshield, we at least have a lot better chance at seeing where we can go. And I think this is analogous also to situations where, we all want evidence. We all want conclusive evidence that this is going to work, or many of us do. Again, as you were talking about it earlier, many of the best leaders are really intentional about saying, hey, we're going to break some eggs, whatever analogy they want to use. We're going to make some mistakes, but it's really this idea that we're driving and we're looking out the windshield that's going to make us more informed. It's not to say we don't want to think about the rear view mirror at all. Most importantly, let's think about the mistakes that we made. If we don't think about the mistakes and learn from the historical context of things that have occurred, then we're likely to repeat them.
Yeah, but it sounds like what you're saying is a lot of organizations just get fixated on what's happened and even where they are versus where they're trying to get to and go.
That's exactly right. And when the road's coming at you faster and faster, it's an incredible challenge. But again, all the more reason that we have to trust the team, we have to listen to the team, we have to be asking better questions.
Yeah, exactly. Great. I love it. So let's talk a little bit about, I know you have a philosophy, I think, around the core four that's that you were sharing that I really found interesting.
Yeah, let me just do one other thing before we dig into that I think will be helpful. Is that I do think one of the things as we're thinking about what we want to do into the future and how we want to function as a team, and how do we really get the team to start to think about things differently and really appreciating each other's opinions. One of the challenges in the boardroom or in the team meeting room is that we tend to want to hurry to a consensus, right? But we often pick one idea over another. We seldom have the opportunity to allow competing ideas to coexist, right? And so one of the exercises that I think is really valuable is to think about things in terms of using tools. Now, this was originally developed by an organization called Hofstede Insights, and basically these are dimensions that are used by businesses who are doing business internationally, who are thinking about what are the differences about the countries that we want to enter versus the country that we are from originally. And so there are things like individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term versus short-term. An example of long-term versus short-term would be, we tend to think in terms of long-term planning as 3 to 5 years, but in Asia, they're thinking of 50, 100-year kinds of plans. Things like power distance, how far down the organizational structure are we willing to allow people to make decisions? These kinds of conversations and just talking about what each of these mean as a team can be very empowering to the team, because really as we want to work together and as we want to work, as teams more effectively, having conversations where nothing is at stake. It's really just a conversation, and it's really just an idea of letting people express, their thoughts about these things. What's fascinating about this is there are perceptions about how different generations may feel about this. We always talk about, the millennials and Gen Zs versus the Xers and the boomers. And we talk about, how there are so many differences generationally. And oftentimes we find that just isn't really true. They're just different philosophies. People are people, and they have different thoughts about things. And so having value-added conversations around themes like this, where we're not trying to solve a problem. It's truly just, let's understand each other a little better. these kinds of conversations, I think, are really, really helpful.
That's interesting. So you coach leaders to actually have conversations around each of these areas with their whole team. So they really,
That's Yeah, and I have a simple set of questions that I give them to really, and I always say with anything that I give any leaders or any teams, I say these are starter questions or these are starter discussion points. Change them, adapt them, make them your own. But the important thing is that we're having conversations
Mhm.
that really do allow us to understand one another better and
Mhm.
understand how we approach problem solving differently. And a lot of teams will use things like DISC, the predictive index. There are all these different personality profiles that are based in it's all based in Jung essentially, and his teachings. But at the same time, we don't really just have conversations anymore, about things to get to know each other better, other than the kind of the artificial feeling, tell me about yourself. And, it just, these are ways that we can have conversations that are really more meaningful conversations, but at the same time, there's nothing really at stake. And we only are going to benefit, from learning about one another and how we feel about these issues.
Yeah, I would imagine there's some amazing things that come out of this. I think about organizations that I've been part of, and there's a lot of these components here that there was a real difference in opinion, I think, in terms of people on the team. There was lack of consistency around thought on this, and I don't think that's the aim, is that everybody's consistent, but to understand everybody's perspective.
That's exactly right. And also I really am a big proponent of this idea of coexistence. Even if we make a decision to go in a different direction, can we at least acknowledge that or are there some elements of another competing idea that can actually make what we were planning to do better?
Mm.
And the more that we can really be intentional about having those conversations and really including other people's thoughts and ideas, the better served the entire team's going to be.
Yeah,
In my
exactly.
experience.
I like it. That's terrific stuff. Great.
The other thing that's interesting is when we think about, there's this major shift that's going on that people don't often think about or talk about, in part because these next couple slides I'm going to share with you really show that we've had this massive explosion in the global middle class. And the interesting thing about that is that most people don't even know that there is a transition going on at all. We tend to we know that there's growth or we know that there's tension. We don't really know what the numbers are. These next couple slides actually come out of 60 pages of reports by a gentleman named Homi Karas at the Brookings Institute on the middle class. But basically, we tend to think that the U.S. and the developed West is, just, omnipotent in terms of the world and that our culture, is preferred, when in fact, there's a whole different group of people who have a lot of the same philosophies, but have different ways that they've approached things just because of the way their country or their families even have developed. And the realities are that in 2009, we had 1 billion members of the middle class in all of the West. That's all of Europe and all of North America. And in the rest of the world, Latin America and Asia, Africa, the Middle East, there were only 847 million members of the middle class. Fast forward to 2015, the West grew by 57 million. Meanwhile, the East grew by over 1 billion members of the middle class. And by 2030, we're going to grow another 28 million in the West. The rest of the world is going to more than double again at 4.3 billion members of the middle class. Now, these numbers may be, the time period that it takes to get there may be a little bit longer, just as a result of what's happened presently. But at the same time, this trend is continuing, and it's a massive shift. And so, as challenged as we feel things are now, what we have to realize is that there really is going to be a massive sea change in terms of the East now influencing the West, as opposed to the West just influencing the East.
Mm. Interesting. So what does a leader need to do with that right now? What's kind of the takeaway for them?
I think that the real takeaway there is that it really is a situation that just need to be aware. It's more of an awareness than anything. The
Yeah.
great thing is that the same conversations that we were having with the team in trying to understand the team better are going to serve us well. I mean, this is what this stuff was designed for originally from Hofstede, is to really think about how are we going to better understand. Because at the end of the day, John, we need to think about how we're going to be impacting the world as a team. But maybe if we're not in a place to do that, we at least need to be thinking about how the world's going to impact us, and how our industry is going to change, how the supply chain might change, how, there are a lot of things that can come into play, that we just need to be thinking of. And fortunately, this, what seemed like a silly kind of an exercise maybe for within the team suddenly has a different meaning when it's really practice also for the bigger game, that we're ultimately all going to have to play.
Exactly. Yeah. That's interesting. I did not realize that that was that much of a shift going on. And my guess is most people are totally unaware of that.
That's and I will tell you, it is. People really have no idea. When you look at the numbers from just strictly from a regional basis. I mean, look at what's happened. Asia goes from being 28% of the world's middle class to 65.
Wow.
North America goes from 18 to 7. The Middle East and Africa are going to be 9%. Latin America is going to be 6%. Latin America is going to be almost, in terms of members of the middle class by 2030, they're going to have almost as many members of the middle class as we do in North America. And Africa and the Middle East are going to actually start to dwarf. And when you consider, people say, well, how is this possible? And the reality is it's really fairly simple in that it's really all around demographics. Back in the 70s and 80s, since I know we're about the same age, as you recall, I'm sure you couldn't turn on the television without seeing, let's feed the hungry in Asia, let's feed the hungry in Africa, let's feed the hungry in Latin America. And fortunately, in spite of the many challenges that we've created for ourselves as a nation, unfortunately, we have been the most generous nation in the world in terms of giving tools, technology, know-how. And that's really what's driven this, is ultimately when infant mortality rates finally went down in these developing areas, people are resilient. And once people are resilient, well, then we also had this need for lower cost labor that we call globalization, that really swept across. So it was a perfect storm. And so that's what we're seeing now, is that the boomers that we know in the West were born when people came back and decided to make love, not war, right? I mean, that's how the boomers boomed in our area, or in the West. In the rest of the world, the boomers are actually in their 20s and 30s and early 40s. So it's a much younger population as well. So it's really going to be fascinating to see what unfolds, and enormous opportunities for the people who do recognize it and really who embrace diversity. I mean, it's I know we're obviously, that's a huge issue that we're wrestling with now. But I hate to say it, it seems to me that we as Americans we need to grow up. I mean, we look at other nations, and we as a nation we struggle where other nations have really put this issue to bed long ago.
Well, it's interesting. I think as a leader, one of the most important things that you need to be able to do is understand, where things are going and the trends and what that means, and connect the dots. And so many leaders live in, their petri dish of what their current existence is, and that's it. They don't understand where things are going. So very helpful.
So really important for all of us to understand, because if we think these numbers aren't going to impact us in the very near future, we're kidding ourselves.
Yeah, our world is changing.
Yep, no question.
Good. So I know we're running a little bit short on time, but that's exactly, I think we're headed right to the right place. I'd love to have you share a little bit about the Core 4.
Yeah, so this is a process that I've developed that I call next chapter planning. And so it came out of really the amalgamation of all my experiences in dealing with major transitions of leadership, ownership, or both, with entrepreneurs and family enterprises. And so essentially, what I often say, as an acronym to remember the core four, is you want to teeter before you run. And if you think about it, we all really kind of struggle even when we're first starting to walk. Eventually we can, and even today, and I'm not as young as I used to be. I feel like it takes me a little while longer to get started. And so essentially the core four are four themes that I believe teams really need to think about. And again, this is great fodder for conversations, if nothing else. So the core four are trust, which just means, we want to talk about as a team, how much trust do we have within the team? How strongly do we trust one another? How strongly do we trust our suppliers? Do any of us have concerns, especially in times like these? Do any of us have concerns about our suppliers being able to supply, to fulfill their promises to us? And then how much do our team members trust us, and how much do our customers and clients trust us? These are all critical questions that we need to get honest answers for. But it also provides a place that we can really then focus on reinforcing and developing if we identify that there are some gaps. No surprise, the second theme is relationships, very closely tied to trust. Again, I think one of the things that we tend to think about as it relates to relationships as leaders is we're constantly looking externally. Let's have better relationships with our customers. Let's have better relationships, with our suppliers. Let's have better relationships with our clients, whoever we're serving. And we often miss what's probably the most important thing to think about, and that is, how do we ensure that we have good relationships with our team members, and that our team members have good relationships among one another? Those are really critical issues that we don't often think about. We tend to think more externally about it. We don't tend to think internally. And it can be just as simple as just taking a few minutes or a few extra minutes in a meeting to have a conversation, about what's going on with someone individually, just to show that we really care about them and what's happening to them. Mm-hmm. The third core element is time. And again, how do we spend our time? Are we making good use of our time? You and I were talking a week or so ago about this issue, and the average meeting, as you and I agreed, was 1 hour. And it's like, do we really need to take an hour as a team, or do we really need to have standard meetings be 30 minutes and just compress? Because most of the time, I find that really 20 or 30 minutes of an hour-long meeting is substantive. The rest, not so much. And then the fourth element is responsibility, and that's really binary in nature. It's both being financially responsible and socially responsible. And those two things really are inseparable, in my opinion, especially as leaders today, especially as we look for younger talent, because if we're not demonstrating, how we're socially responsible, not just financially responsible, and how much money people are going to make, while working with us, or how much of the bottom line we need to grow, and also not thinking about how we're going to make a positive impact on our region, our world, wherever we may operate, we're going to be challenged.
Yeah. I love this because it's simple, and it's a great, extremely important concept that's broken down, because I think a lot of teams and organizations just get overwhelmed. It's like, okay, well, there's, we got to focus on 50 or 100 different things. But, your point here is a really good one, that these are the four that are really the core. Before you do anything else, you have to have these, and these have got to be rock solid. You look at trust, and I talk a lot about that. There are things that leaders do or teams do that unknowingly erode trust. And when that happens and you don't have an organization that really has a high level of trust, you can't go to a great big high place. It just will not, you just can't actually get the team there. So I really like this. And my guess is, in working with organizations, they've seen pretty dramatic results when they've really focused on this first and gotten this down. That's the foundation for everything.
That's right. And we've got a simple assessment process that we take teams through. And one example of just how quickly we can move the needle is I had a whole C-level leadership team for a company that I was working with. And literally, vice president of sales, marketing, had the CEO, COO, CFO, and then, the second layer of leadership team. interesting thing that happened was, the whole team assesses themselves around financial responsibility. The rest of the team, leadership team, scores the company at an 8 or a 9, and the CFO ranked him at a 4. And so, it was a great, opportunity to say, okay, wow, we're way off here. Well, it turned out, John, it was just a matter of the CFO had been lobbying for, excuse me, for some new financial control software. Essentially, it was just, they needed some better controls around financial control software. So in other words, wanted to keep better track of receivables and payables. And then they were a little bit concerned about some of the policies around signing checks, and literally looked at the rest of the team, said all those in favor of, getting Gail the software that she needs. It was literally a few $1,000s, which to this organization, they had fairly significant budget. It was not a big deal, but it just shows you how having conversations in different ways can really lead to really having making meaningful progress. And to your point, we do, especially today, as things get complicated and convoluted and we're dealing with all the strategies and the tactics, we really need to just take a step back and focus on what's really important. And this really, in the simplest of terms, is a way to help solve problems, thematically. It's really just a tool to help us do that.
Right. And well, it's amazing what those conversations open up. And there you go. You solve a problem with just asking the right questions. And this is a really good framework to do it. So great stuff.
Exactly.
I know we're running out of time here. This has been fantastic. I got a zillion more questions to ask you, but for the audience, what would you like to leave them with as maybe another thought or concept before we do wrap?
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is that I do think that as we get really good at focusing on these core 4 elements, there really is a whole new world that we can open up. And you see here, the reference in the slide to the semis. Again, it's another acronym. And so when we think about what does it mean when we get to the semis as an organization, it means, maybe we don't win the big game, but we're in the big game. We're really right there with the best of them. And what's nice is that we can actually, through really developing trust, relationships, responsibility, and time, we can start to then think about higher functioning things. Again, to your point, we need to have those really foundationally solid, but then we can start to think about how do we create better experiences? Again, not just for our customers and our clients, but also for our team. How can we become more ingenious? How can we have more ingenuity as an organization? A lot of organizations want to talk about innovation. Well, innovation oftentimes can really result in just a lot of running in place. We can be very innovative, but we're not actually going somewhere. So I'm a much bigger believer in ingenuity than just in innovation itself. And then mindfulness, as you can see, it's really in the illustration, you got someone that looks like they're doing yoga with the globe, hanging over their head. And it really is, because it is 2 things. Again, it's binary. It's about being in the present. So when we're meeting, are we really focused on the things that we need to be focused on? And then again, do we have this global mindset? Are we thinking about how we're going to impact the world, or at a minimum, how's the world going to impact us? And then spirit and or spirituality. Sometimes that can have religious connotations. Sometimes it does not. Obviously people think about businesses that have been very successful, that are overtly religious. People think about organizations like Chick-fil-A. But at the same time, spirituality, in my opinion, as it relates to teams, is really just about, what is it that is the special glue that keeps us together? What is it that really makes us a truly cohesive team? And there usually is, again, this is what's interesting when you talk to teams about this, different people have different ideas about what the special glue really is. At the end of the day, why can't we allow that to coexist? And it's really something that can allow our businesses, our organizations to be special to a lot of people in a lot of different ways that maybe we didn't even realize.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this has been fantastic, Vaughan. You've given, I know, everybody a lot to think about, and some great perspective. If people want to follow up with you and get a hold of you, how do they do that?
Yeah, the easiest way is can just reach me through the College of Business at the University of Louisville. My email address is Vaughan. It's VAUGHAN, two A's in Vaughan, like Stevie Ray. .Scott at Louisville.edu. And then easiest way to also reach me, especially today, is via mobile, 502-500-2242.
Excellent. All right, my friend. Well, this has been terrific. And I hope maybe at some point down the road we'll get you back and we'll do part 2 of this.
Love to do it. Thanks so much for having me, John.
You got it, Vaughan. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. As always, appreciate all your likes, your comments. Appreciate you sharing this and also your ideas on future guests, future topics. Most importantly, take what you learned today, do something with it, further yourself, further other people, further your organizations. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.